As mentioned at the tail end of our last section, Section 14 is going to cover types of customs entries. Actually, because this is a really important and pretty involved subject, we're going to dedicate 2 sections to types of customs entries, 14 and 15, so we can go into the proper detail. Although a great deal of upfront work must be done by an importer prior to submitting an entry to CBP, one of the first steps in understanding the import process is to distinguish between the various types of entries that exist, recalling that an entry is the electronic presentation of import shipment specific information around the product description, its value, country of origin, bills of lading number, conveyance, etc. These are electronic entries that really require a lot of the same information. They're just different types of entries because they have a different purpose. To summarize what we just spoke of, second bullet, based on those earlier definitions, that entry is the electronic presentation of shipment-specific info required by and submitted to CBP. And to wrap up this slide, last bullet, there are many different types of customs entries allowed in the U.S. And as we also spoke of a moment ago, these different types of entries are defined by their purpose. What is trying to be accomplished with a given entry? That's how they're divvied up. We'll start off with the most common and frequent type of entry in the U.S. It's called a consumption entry. And a quick spoiler alert here, we'll see it in just one moment, but it's easy to remember what a consumption entry is because goods are coming into the U.S., entering into the commerce of the U.S. to be consumed. Perhaps a finished good purchased in a retail store that was imported from Spain. Maybe raw materials that were imported from Brazil that will be put into a production process. Consumption means use in customs parlance. To add a little bit to that impromptu definition, second bullet, upon presentation of electronic information to CBP and barring any issues, goods are immediately entered into the commerce of the U.S. We're talking about that consumption entry here. To use some customs terminology we see in our sub-bullet, the goods are to be used or put up for sale in the U.S., used in a production process as a raw material, put up for sale on an e-commerce website. That's the meaning there. And as we said, parenthetically, we'll say it again, think of a consumption entry as certainly the most common type of entry, but that the goods in some way, shape, or fashion are going to come into the U.S., enter the commerce, and be consumed. Last bullet here, consumption entries are further divided into 2 types. That is a formal entry, defined as having a value of $2,500 or greater, and an informal entry less than $2,500 in value. When we go through actual entries, we'll have examples of both. For now, we want to be able to divide up consumption entries into a formal and an informal entry, both of which are driven by the value of the importation itself. Moving away from consumption entries, another type is referred to as a warehouse entry, which is also known as a bonded entry. We've talked a little bit about bonded warehouses and such. This is where the story becomes a little more granular. Second bullet, warehouse entries are used when goods are to be transferred to a bonded warehouse without having entered into the commerce of the United States. Think of it this way. Bonded means that goods are in the country physically, but they haven't entered into the commerce of the United States. They're in a bonded facility or being moved physically while under bond. Warehouse entries in general play a big part of that whole bonded storyline. An example might be, as noted in our sub-bullet, is an ocean container that hasn't cleared through customs, but is being moved from a port terminal to a bonded warehouse. The physical movement, as well as storage in that bonded warehouse, requires a customs entry. Third bullet, we've said this a number of times, just said it a minute ago, under a warehouse entry. Goods are in the U.S., but they haven't entered into the commerce of the U.S. As a trade tip, there are several different types of bonded warehouse operations approved by CBP. We'll see more on that later, but there are bonded operations as a container freight station where goods can't be manipulated, basically. There are bonded operations that can hold product for a longer period of time. Again, we'll talk more about that later, but for now, as a trade tip, there are several different types of bonded warehouse operations approved by CBP. Needless to say, permits have to be applied for, customs approved, etc. Continuing on with the idea of a warehouse entry, because typically goods go into a bonded warehouse and then they come back out, closely associated with that warehouse entry is what is called a warehouse withdrawal. Goods go in under bond, they come out. The latter is referred to as a warehouse withdrawal. Goods that are in a bonded warehouse require submission of a warehouse withdrawal to CBP in order to be removed from the bonded facility. And it's very likely, but not necessary, that the goods coming out of a bonded warehouse will be entered into the commerce of the United States and ultimately consumed. That entire process is managed through a warehouse entry. As a trade tip, and this demonstrates at least one of the advantages for having goods in a bonded warehouse. It's not the number one or only reason why, but if we look at it from a financial perspective, duties on goods that are in a bonded facility are paid when the merchandise is withdrawn from the bonded facility. We should state that the different levels of a bonded warehouse operation approved by CBP have a lot to do with how this topic works, but it's certainly feasible that we as an importer could bring $1 million of merchandise into a bonded warehouse and then withdraw those goods a little bit at a time. We don't pay duties when they go into the bonded warehouse. We only pay duties when they're withdrawn from the warehouse. We could have $1 million worth of an item in a bonded warehouse and receive an order from a customer in the U.S. for $100,000. We can withdraw, do a warehouse withdrawal for the $100,000 and only pay duties on the $100,000. There are other advantages, we'll talk more about them, to using bonded facilities, but that's a big one. As we said, we're going to divvy up types of customs entries into two sections. We're going to stop here, and when we come back for section 15, we'll talk about foreign trade zone entries, a super interesting subject.